All right, let's go over chapters 10 through 12. So in chapter 10, you get another analytical tool in your toolbox, and that is the 10-on-1 strategy. And I know I didn't have you read a whole lot of this chapter, but that's because I just wanted you to get an idea of what 10-on-1 was and how you can use it, and that's about it. So you really are probably used to doing 1 on 10, which is you're looking at making one observation on 10 different examples. So what this chapter is teaching you to do is to make 10 observations on one example. It's teaching you to get further into something and to look deeper at it. So, I mean, that is a really good skill to have. You don't want to just skim over things like you may have been taught in your previous writing courses. You really need to get into your sources sometimes and make 10 different observations about one text just to see how your perspective changes on that. So the point of it's not to rush to any conclusion, but to really take your time and to really observe. So see how you can give this a try somewhere, because it really is another tool that'd be helpful for you to use. So in chapter 11, we get into the 2 chapters on thesis statements. And thesis statements are really complex. They are absolutely essential to your writing. So I'm hoping that these 2 chapters weren't overwhelming for you, but help you to at least get some ideas of what you can do to make your thesis stronger and how to apply this to your writing. I don't expect you to have perfect thesis statements from now on. It is a process, and writing thesis statements is very difficult in terms of trying to get, exactly what the book's asking you to do. So all I want you to do is try to improve in one aspect or another. Okay, so pretty much your thesis is the idea that you're going to develop in your paper, whether it's the main point that you're going to make about a summary. Your thesis is your interpretation that you're making about something. It's the main point of your argument that you might be making. So any type of paper that you write needs to have a thesis statement of some type. When you begin your writing process, you always want to start with a working thesis. And what a working thesis is just a thesis statement that you have created that you think might be what you would use in your paper, but it's just a starting point. That's why it's a working thesis. It can be manipulated, it can be adjusted, it can be revised, it can be all of that, but at least it gives you a focus, because nothing really is set in stone until your paper's turned in. You can always revise, and it's not uncommon for students to have a working thesis, then to do all their planning and researching and all that, and then at the end find out, I just proved my thesis wrong. And then all you have to do is flip your thesis around and then write your paper. So really, when you go into planning your essays, you need to start with a thesis. You need to know where you're headed, but know that your thesis can change and that it can evolve and that it can, change. So, and be comfortable with that. It's totally fine. You don't, like this quote I have, good thesis statements are the product of writing, not its precursor. And that's true. You may not know exactly what you're going to write about. You may not even have a focus other than your general topic. And as you start researching, you will start to formulate a working thesis that you can then use in your paper. Okay, so don't think that you have to start your process with a thesis statement written in stone that you can't deviate from. I'm not going to know the difference. All I ask is that you have a good thesis statement in your paper. How you get to that point is totally up to you. Your thesis statement should be complex, because the more complex your thesis statements are, the more you'll be able to explore and develop them in the body of your essay. And the book really kind of harps on that it has to have complexity, that it's got to be something arguable and analyzable, and it's got to tie in all your evidence. So be aware of that as you are creating your thesis statement. It's not just a simple, I am going to talk about this. That's not a thesis statement, or at least a good one anyway. Excuse me. Another quote I have says, the thesis not only directs the writer's way of looking at evidence, the analysis of evidence should also direct and redirect or bring about revision of the thesis. Okay, so everything works together. Every sentence in your paper essentially needs to be supporting that thesis statement that you give. whether directly or indirectly. Okay? And I mean, that's very easy to do. I can sit back and look at a sentence and go, this has absolutely nothing to do with our thesis statement. Their focus is off. Okay? Remember that whole kebab metaphor. It's the skewer that keeps everything together. And if you don't have everything related, that's when things fall apart. Excuse me. Still a little sick. Thesis placement, excuse me, is really up to you. You have a lot of freedom in where you put your thesis statement. The one thing I will say with that, with writers at your level, most of you are not necessarily ready to put your thesis statement other places. You can technically have your thesis statement in the middle of your paper. You can build up to it, and then you can come down from it. You can start with it in your beginning, in the beginning of your paper, and develop it, or you can build to it and end with it in your conclusion. But it takes a lot of skill to do that. So if you're uncomfortable with that, put it in your intro and leave it there. Now, if you have your thesis statement in your conclusion, that doesn't mean your introduction doesn't need to be just as focused. I like to think about your thesis statement as the single most powerful sentence or group of sentences in your paper. That's why it can go anywhere. But your introduction still has to introduce your topic, still has to introduce where you're going with your topic, even if that most powerful sentence is not in that paragraph. Does that make sense? That's why you can build up to it and come down from it, or you can build up to it and end on it in your conclusion. It's just a really powerful sentence that sums up what you are trying to say. So it can go anywhere, but be very careful on where you place it and how you develop it. So chapter 12 shifts into recognizing and fixing weak thesis statements. So make sure that your thesis statements are strong and that they require analysis to support it, and that it uncovers the significance of your evidence. Again, I said this is a little bit ago, that everything in your paper works together with your thesis statement, and it's got to be complex. It's got to make your reader think, and yet it still has to guide your reader through your paper. Again, make sure your thesis statement is complex enough to build a paper on, especially if it's more of an argumentative type essay. It needs to be complex. And the 5 types of weak thesis statements in the book are very common. Very, 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 very common. I'm sure as you read through them, you realize, oh, yeah, I do that. I read through it and went, oh, I did that in college. Whoops. And that's why I say I'm not expecting you to come out of reading these chapters with 100% perfect thesis statement. It's really just not going to happen, but you need to be more aware. You need to try to make them better. Try to make them more complex. So I'm not expecting you to memorize the different types of weak thesis statements, but I want you to remember them enough to avoid them. Okay? Because you don't want these type of thesis statements. And then at the end of the chapter, it talks about thesis questions and whether or not that's okay. I'm going to answer that for you and say, no, it's not okay. I don't like rhetorical questions. Rhetorical questions to me are a crutch that students use a lot, and I don't like them. I want you to be more creative. I want you to be more academic. Do not state your thesis statement as a rhetorical question. I don't think anybody's done it so far this quarter, but I know I've seen it. And again, I don't like it. There's a better way to write than that. And to me, that's a excuse me, that is a crutch that I don't want you relying on. Okay, so I kind of quickly covered these 3 chapters, but I gave you the meat that I really want you to know. So again, just keep trying to improve your thesis statements, really be aware of where they are in your paper and how you develop them. And as always, if you have any questions, let me know.